Even if you're not sure what goes on inside or what it's officially called, this building commands attention. Nestled at the top end of University Avenue in Toronto is one of Ontario's most iconic landmarks, a grand structure designed to house the province's politicians. While it's officially named the Ontario Legislative Building, it's more commonly referred to as Queen's Park or Ontario's Parliament, and for some, even the Pink Palace. Yes, the Pink Palace. Ontario's fourth legislative building has a unique color tone to it. A rosy facade from the Credit Valley sandstone that was used in the original construction, quarried from the Credit Valley near Orangeville and delivered on site where it was carved. More than 10 million bricks were used in the construction of this building, a complex project with some of the work being carried out by inmates from what was then called Central Prison. At the time, this was among one of the largest public buildings on the continent, and the construction specs were meticulously detailed, every aspect carefully planned, from mandating that all cement and stone used must be Canadian to specifying the exact pattern in which the bricks would be laid. The asymmetrical five-story structure was built in the Richardson Romanesque style, a popular theme in the late 1880s that featured rough-faced stonework, rounded arches, and deeply recessed doors and windows. The design was created by architect Richard A. Waite. He was British-born but emigrated to the U.S. as a young child, living in Buffalo, New York. He was the first American architect to be commissioned by the Canadian government, a decision that was somewhat controversial.
Mr. Waite was one of the three judges of the international design competition that had started in 1880, and they did come up with a short list of designs by 1882. Most of those were local. Then Mr. Waite started to kind of make some opinions about these designs and felt that they were inadequate. And so the government decided to retain him for advice on these architectural drawings that had been coming through to them. And as time went by, we're talking several years, they began to come back to Mr. Waite more and more, and Mr. Waite at the same time was coming back to them and saying, here's what can be done, and eventually submitted his own set of plans in 1885.
The initial build budget was set at $500,000, but in the end, Mr. Waite's vision cost almost 3 times that, with a final bill of $1.4 million. Yet, his work has been praised, citing in particular his decision on where he placed the chamber.
This building was really his masterpiece. He was very considerate both from an inside and outside perspective. By placing the chamber up front and facing south, showing towards the public, it had a lot to do with accountability of what the government was doing.
Designing such a structure and building it with local supplies is one thing, keeping it fire safe was another.
The materials were pushing them up against the wall. I mean, this building, for example, had cast iron, it had wood, it had wainscoting, wood flooring, so it was really susceptible to a fire.
Although historical records indicate there were in fact a few fires on the premises, the most significant occurred on September 1st, 1909.
There were some workers on the roof of the building. They were using a charcoal burner that was being used to melt metal, tin, and the tinsmiths would then use it to the melted tin to fill in the holes on the roof. They weren't being careful because with the charcoal sparking, as it did on a windy afternoon, the sparks were flying off and landing on the roof and being fanned into larger flames. The roof structure began to collapse. Once the roof collapsed, it burned through the lower floors below, and the biggest damage was to the Legislative Library. It damaged over 100,000 books. In fact, pretty much torched the entire collection.
In the northwest attic, 2 major milestones in this iconic building's history come vividly into view. The burn scars from that fateful day are still visible on the chimney. The original support beams cut off, but still in place, just as they were positioned over a century ago. It was one of the only parts of the structure to withstand the intense flames, and today remains in place, surrounded by the rebuild. Designed by prominent Toronto architect Edwards James Lennox, the entire west wing was reconstructed starting in 1912.
He basically wrapped a new building or a new section of building around Mr. Waite's original design. So Mr. Lennox added an extra 2 floors to the structures. Originally, the building on both sides was symmetrical with 3 floors, but Mr. Lennox here on the west side of the building really added a physical 5th floor, which was to encompass more office space.
The west wing is noticeably different. On the outside, the original sandstone was no longer available, so they opted for a somewhat similar replacement, Sackville stone from New Brunswick. The changes are much more dramatic on the inside.
So one thing that people will notice if they come for a visit, between the east and the west wing, the east wing remains with that hand-carved wood. The west wing, which relates to where we were in terms of the fire, is all in marble now.
Right, and this is where you can see Mr. Lennox's interior design more very carefully considering finishes like marble, but the marble has a purpose. It covers over a steel structure. This is all going into the fact that this is a much more fireproof part of the building now with less wood exposed.
The marble originates from central Italy, brought in by Disparate Marble, which at the time had a facility in Toronto. They are still in business to this day in the U.S. and are world-renowned for their highly skilled artisan mosaic work, an art form that dates back to ancient times.
They're called a tesserae. It's a type of term for the marble that's all laid out, sort of laid by hand very carefully, and this goes up on all 4 floors of the west wing of the building.
The sandstone archways, grand staircase, warm wood accents, and majestic marble all weave together to tell the story of this magnificent building. Like chapters in a captivating book, each element pulls you in, inviting you to explore deeper and uncover more about its rich history and timeless charm. For the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, I'm Anwar Knight.